And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
That's right, Greta. It is Friday. And I hope you're comfortable in some air-conditioned location. And the same for all of you out there as well watching this stream. This is Climate Realism Show number 118, Climate Lawfare Heats Up. I'm Jim Lakely, Vice President of the Heartland Institute, and your guest host today. Your regular host, Anthony Watts, is somewhere enjoying the high-carbon lifestyle, no doubt. There is no other show on YouTube or Rumble or other places, and even Twitter, quite like the Climate Realism Show. So I hope you will like this show, share it, subscribe to our channels, and personally tell folks about it. The more the merrier in our live chats on YouTube and Rumble especially. And as a reminder, because big tech and the legacy media do not like the way we cover climate and energy news policy on this program, Heartland's YouTube channel has been demonetized. So if you want to support this program and what we do at the Heartland Institute, and I hope you do, please visit heartland.org/TCRS. TCRS, that stands for the Climate Realism Show, and help us keep making the show happen every single week. Any support you can give is very greatly appreciated. So for today's program, we have our usual panelists. We have Dr. H. Sterling Burnett, Director of the Arthur B. Robinson Center on Climate and Environmental Policy here at the Heartland Institute. We also have with us Linnea Lueken. She's a research fellow for energy and environmental policy at Heartland and the star of our Climate at a Glance video series right here at the Heartland Institute YouTube channel and on Rumble. So be sure to check those out. We are releasing 2 new videos every week. I think there's 31 of them and we're about halfway through. So there's going to be lots of programming on Climate at a Glance all the way through the summer. And the viewership for those things just keep growing. And we are also very happy to welcome back as a special guest, the one, the only Marc Morano. Marc is the executive editor of ClimateDepot.com, a project of our friends at CFACT. He's the author of several books, including The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown, Green Fraud, Why the Green New Deal is Even Worse Than You Think, and also The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. Marc is also a frequent speaker at Heartland's climate conferences and a man who relishes being called one of the most attacked men in the climate realist movement. Congratulations on that, Marc, and welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone. Happy to be here today. Appreciate it.
Great. And how are you doing, Sterling and Linnea? Linnea, I understand you just returned home from a trip.
Yeah, I was in DC this week. Very cool conference that I went to. Interesting people. It was a lot of fun. A lot of people who are definitely on our side of this issue. So that's always nice to see, especially those who, might not be more on the libertarian side of politics on the right, but definitely are allies in the fight against net zero and stuff like that. So it was really cool.
Great. And stuff we talk about on this program all the time. And Sterling, you were coming from us from a bunker somewhere in the greater Dallas Metroplex area. We will not disclose.
Well, if bunkers are on second floors, I guess you could call it a bunker. I'm here, fully air conditioned. You mentioned that at the outset. Yes, I'm one of those that has his air conditioning running, as my power bill will attest. Is already attesting at the end of the month, and praying, by the way, that my power stays on, not because I'm in South Texas affected by the hurricane, but because Texas legislature allowed wind and solar to take over the grid. And so every summer when the wind stops blowing in West Texas, where the wind farms are located, the power drops off and we struggle to keep the lights on. So let's keep our fingers crossed throughout the broadcast.
Yes, for sure. It always just blows my mind that Texas depends so much on wind and solar, considering their history of fossil fuel exploration. I mean, gosh, J.R. Ewing is spinning in his grave.
But people don't realize it, but Texas actually has huge coal reserves, and we used to burn our coal here in Texas. It's not like we had to ship it across the nation to us. No, we mined coal here. We delivered it mine mouth coal power plants, and we've shut those down. And instead, what we do is we build solar that gets smashed by hail, and wind that doesn't blow when it's not convenient. And we have to build more natural gas, which is, of course, why my bills are going up, because natural gas is peaking right now.
Yep. All right. Well, let's go. We have a pretty big show today. As I was putting the show notes together, it's like, golly, we have a lot of stuff to cover, especially on the climate lawfare front. The idea came from Sterling to do this today, and by golly, there is a lot of news. But I think it's important to start the program off, and it's fortuitous that we have Marc Morano as our guest today, because this week, former United States Senator from Oklahoma, Senator Jim Inhofe, passed away. And Marc, you were a climate researcher for Jim Inhofe. Senator Inhofe had spoken at least, I think, 2 of Heartland's climate conferences over the years. He was I've spent some time in Washington. You've spent a lot of time in Washington, Marc Morano. Our Congress, unfortunately, seems to be populated by people who are either not that bright or not that curious, or both, or liars. And I think Senator Inhofe distinguished himself on a topic that did not make him very popular, even in his own caucus, when it came to fighting junk science and pushing for realistic climate and energy policies in the United States.
Yeah, and it's a huge loss for anyone who cares about rational climate energy policy in America, and it's a huge personal loss for him and his family. He had, so many children. His wife Kay survives him. He had great grandchildren, and he was just the ultimate senator to work for. And I talked to a lot of other staff. I worked up there a lot of years. He was none of any of the bad stories you ever heard. He was just awesome to work for. He was kind, compassionate, decent, civil to his staff. There were no temper tantrums, no tirades. And the most important thing about him, he was a man of principle. This is a guy who in the United States Senate basically stood alone. I mean, there were other senators at the time who may have agreed with him. I think Coburn from Oklahoma was one, but they weren't in a position of power, like the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee, which is where I worked for him. I was his communication director, I hate to say climate researcher, but I collected all the names for the dissenting scientists report. And Inhofe stood alone. So I submit to you, for those of you who don't think one man or one woman can make a difference, I submit to you James Mountain Inhofe, James M. Inhofe, who literally stood up against the United Nations. We had Rajendra Pachauri come testify. He stood up against all of academia. We had endless professors. He stood up against the media. He stood up against the Republican establishment. He stood up against the entire political uniparty in Washington and said, no, we're not going to allow this to happen. And though this was, even during the Bush administration, there was some soundings of early capitulation on climate policy. But when Obama was elected, I was still working for him, and he was single-handedly helped derail cap and trade in the United States Senate. So effectively, I might add, that Obama's signature climate bill was so damaged by the time Jim Inhofe got through with it, exposing it, even recruiting Democrats to oppose it. At one point, Senators Al Franken and 7 other Rust Belt Democrats throughout Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, basically said, we can't support this bill because it was bad for America, bad for American industry. It was supporting China. And it was so embarrassing. And Inhofe was so effective that Harry Reid, the then Senate Majority Leader, never even submitted Obama's key signature climate bill to the United States Senate. That is the legacy of James Inhofe. But even beyond that, he set a legacy of changing the narrative. And if you go to Climate Depot, I have a long tribute to James Inhofe. But he did a speech in the Senate floor. I believe it was September 2006. And it was a speech that just said, absolutely not. We reject any scientific consensus. This is none of this is true. All the claims you hear from Al Gore, the media, and it was point by point. And he went after the media, named the media. The response publicly was something the Senate had never seen. And this continued for several years, to the point where we actually shut down the United States Senate. At the time, Drudge was a conservative libertarian website, actually had a lot of power. He would link directly to us. And I detail this. When he gave that speech, our phones rang off the hook. I remember calling in Andrew Wheeler, who's his chief of staff at the Senate Environment Public Works Committee. And Andrew Wheeler later worked for Trump's EPA, obviously, and now and even Governor Youngkin. But I said, come here, listen to this. I go, I'll just answer. The phones were ringing. I just picked up a random call, put it on speaker, and it was person after person calling to say, thank you, Senator Inhofe. I can't believe it. We always knew this was a con. Finally, an elected official is speaking out clearly and bluntly. There was no mealy-mouthed stuff. And that is the legacy of Senator Inhofe. He single-handedly changed the narrative of this entire debate and built that. And this is why I think where we are today, he did it from a position that I can tell you right now, almost no one else had. I mean, there was a couple others, Congressman Smith from the House Science Committee in the House, who came along later with a lot of climate, but Inhofe was alone. He was the pioneer, high-level government official, the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee, saying not only no, but we don't buy the climate BS scientific claims. And that was a shot heard around the world. And that is truly Inhofe's legacy. And the fruit of that is still being born today.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like you said, it's still the agenda he had set and the positions he had taken 20 years ago are still held by, well, all Republicans on the Hill who actually know the topic.
Change the narrative. That's huge.
Well, let me just ask you real quick, and I'm going to go into a little bit of something that probably will annoy you and me and our listeners and our viewers, is the coverage of his passing. But I'm curious, how did Senator Inhofe come to his position that he had held for so long on climate and energy? I mean, was he, in other words, was he a climate realist and somebody who understood the topic before you started working for him, or did you?
Yeah, by the time I was working for him, but he always tells the story. He grew up in Oklahoma, obviously, oil gas state, and he just never paid much attention. And he always said, I always assumed it was true. You know, especially back in the 90s, when people were all the scientists, and you had James Hansen, and these are NASA scientists. He didn't really pay much attention. He didn't really start paying attention until he realized what it was actually going to do to American energy, which he called the economic engine of the world, this beautiful machine called America, our powerhouse. And that's when he started looking into it. And that's when he started realizing, wait a minute, these are crazy. What are they basing this on? And then he started looking into the science. One of his first big hearings, when he first became chairman of the Senate Republican Environment and Public Works Committee, one of the big hearings he had was to bring in meteorologist Dr. Bill Gray and Michael Crichton. And that was 2000. I have the year wrong on that. Either 2003 or 2005. That set the world on fire initially, because you had Michael Crichton and you had a top scientist like Bill Gray basically demolishing the entire premise of man-made climate change crisis and fears. And certainly by that time, Inhofe was fully on board with this has to be exposed, and that whole agenda has to be exposed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I love Michael Crichton's Climate of Fear, where the climate hippies get killed and eaten, which is really great.
Before we go to the headlines, can I just say one thing about my experience?
Yes.
So I didn't, of course, know Jim Inhofe as closely as well as you, but I did meet him on a couple of occasions. Back before I joined Heartland, different think tank, we hosted a couple of conferences on Capitol Hill, in the Senate and in the House chambers. We were set up. Andrew Wheeler, I think, was instrumental in setting up one of these. And I found him to be, he was principled, but he also delivered things with humor. He was a good, he was a well-meaning and good-spirited man. And he is what I like to think of what a senator of the United States should be. You got to remember, the Senate was set up to represent the separate states. It was originally set up, the senators were appointed by their legislatures to represent that state against against the federal government. And rather than being a statesman, oh, I'm going to be the next president or whatever, like someone like John McCain wants to be bigger than he is, Jim Inhofe defended Oklahoma. Jim Inhofe went up there and said, I'm here first and foremost to support and protect the citizens of my state who put me here. And so he defended its industries. He defended its people. And he promoted construction and stuff in Oklahoma. So I just think he really is a prime example of what a senator is supposed to be.
I agree, and that's an important point. He had a way of disarming even his harshest critics. Even, and I can't remember his name, a climate activist came to the Senate to challenge Inhofe in a hallway, and it was rude, obnoxious. Boy, I don't remember the guy's name now, but I think he was affiliated with CNN at the time. And he came away saying, I couldn't get anywhere because it was like attacking your uncle or your favorite uncle or your grandfather or Ronald Reagan himself. And he just had this likability. Barbara Boxer, his arch enemy, I was with him when he debated her live on Larry King. This was, I want to say 2009, maybe. And we went to CNN headquarters in DC, and right before they went on air, Inhofe, they were sitting right next to each other. Inhofe messed up her hair, which she had just spent all this time. And Boxer, of course, freaked out. But it was a funny moment because Boxer ended up laughing about it. They were the best of friends, actually. And they actually worked together on a lot of infrastructure bills. It was just climate and energy policy that truly divided them. But it's amazing how even the harshest critics of him really liked him personally, and he was just a great guy, a great family man, and it's a huge loss for the Senate and for America. He was an American original.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, well, he may have had people in the Senate who may have disagreed with him and were still friends and friendly and civil. Can't say as much for the mainstream media, the corporate media, the corrupt corporate media in this country. I want to show the viewers of our stream the New York Times headline for the passing of the great James Inhofe. James M. Inhofe, senator who denied climate change, dies at 89. Now, let's also show how the New York Times handled the passing of some other senators of note in recent years. Edward M. Kennedy, Senate stalwart, dead at 77. No mention of, leaving a young woman to die in a car in a little river. I don't know. And also Robert C. Byrd, a pillar of the Senate, dies at 92. A Klansman, a leader in the Klan, not in the headline. Yet Jim Inhofe is going to be known to the readers of the New York Times as for only one thing, and that he denied climate change, Marc Morano. Are you surprised, or do you even care?
I don't care much. And I would say this, knowing Jim Inhofe, I think he would get a chuckle and he would be perfectly fine with that legacy, because he knew he was unique. He knew it was up to him in the United States Senate and the U.S. Congress, given the position of power he held, especially, to be that guy. So I don't think it would have bothered him, but I think it is funny to the New York Times. Again, we already know New York Times columnists, the mainstream media, to them, that's like writing, he denied the Holocaust. That's the equivalent when they write ridiculous headlines like that. That's how disgusted they are that someone like Jim Inhofe could even be a U.S. senator and deny climate change. Inhofe himself, I think, would get a chuckle out of that. And it is ironic, Ted Kennedy and Robert Byrd, how they get the glowing, because they were the right side of the politics that the New York Times likes.
Right. All right. Well, our second segment today, and I appreciate.
Well, before we go on,
yep.
I want to ask Mark one thing. Y'all mentioned briefly the report you put together while Inhofe was there, and I think it's important our readers know about it, and if they can still find it somewhere. So, can you talk about that a bit?
And here's the thing that's weird about it. I have it at Climate Depot. You can go to Climate Depot. It's updated to 1,000 dissenting scientists. Hasn't been up. I mean, when I say updated from the Senate days, it hasn't probably been updated in over a decade. But in the EPW website, every time there's a change of chairman, they change all the URLs. So it's very hard to find anything on the Senate website anymore. But that was a report when I first started there, I started there right when Al Gore's film came out in the spring of 2006. And this was a time when Rajendra Pachauri and all the major networks, and Al Gore and all the UN chiefs, they were all saying there's only about a half a dozen scientists out there who don't believe global warming, and they are the same ones who believe the Earth is flat or the moon landing was faked, et cetera, et cetera. So we had the idea, let's test that theory. So Senator Inhofe and the Environment Public Works Committee, we announced it and started collecting the names, soliciting names from scientists around the world. And we reached out, and it was incredible. And then when we finally released the report, it was December of, right before Christmas, a couple of weeks, like early December, 2006. And Inhofe went down to the Senate floor, read the report, started reading the names. That report was the shot heard around the world because it was the first time. And again, keep in mind, this was during a time when Republicans were fully on board with this. I mean, there was almost in private meetings. I remember really conservative members of the Senate, Republican staffers, their chief aide would be like, oh, our senator doesn't want to say anything. He doesn't want to be seen as against the environment. So we don't know how to handle this. We're just going to focus on only economic costs of whatever proposed legislation. But that bill, I remember it was even Bill O'Reilly changed his coverage of climate change at the time. Fox News picked up on that hugely. Talk radio. That was a seminal report in getting out a new narrative to the people that, hey, these are major prestigious scientists from Harvard, Yale, MIT, NASA, former UN scientists, Nobel Prize winning scientists saying, no, this is not true. They don't agree with Al Gore. They don't agree with the head of the UN. And that was what was so important. And Inhofe used his stature as a senator. And in the report, we even put the Senate seal, which used to drive people nuts because it was a majority report, not officially, like a bipartisan report. But we put the Senate seal in these reports. We had a skeptic's guide to climate change. And it was just heads exploded. You had to put trigger warnings on them, I guess we'd say today, on those reports. But again, it was huge. I just can't tell you. And once Inhofe left, there was actually Senator Vitter he carried on a great legacy. But I got to say this, and I hope I don't offend anyone, or the succeeding chairman of that committee or ranking and minority members, none of them have ever been interested in taking on the science. After Senator Vitter, I believe he was the last one from Louisiana, they all just run scared, including the current Republicans on it. They don't want anything to do with challenging the science, even today, which is kind of sad. But, obviously the constituency is really opposed to it.
Yep. Yes. Well, thanks again, Marc, for being on the show. And I think it was important to have that on the record for the greatest champion for climate realism the Senate has ever seen. And maybe somebody will come up to 80% of his level if we're lucky in the near future. So let's get up to one of our favorite segments here on the Climate Realism Show, and that is the crazy climate news of the week. And Marc Morano, I'm going to have to thank you for giving us our first item on this, because I found this on climatedepot.com. Climate activists lead a funeral procession at Citibank for causing climate death. Mourn all of those killed due to the climate crisis. So we have there we go. There it is up on the screen. So yeah, I mean, just another stunt. This was a funeral procession led by Bill McKibben of 350.org, a radical environmental leftist. His organization, by the way, is called 350.org because his contention was that if the CO2 levels in the atmosphere rose above 350 parts per million, that was the tipping point in which the Earth would become uninhabitable and there was really no way to recover from it. Linnea, what's our parts per million right now?
I believe it's something around 420, but I can look.
It is 420, huh? Well, that's a nice round number.
Could be like
so it's and we're still here. It's over 400 for sure. We're still here. And this procession actually reminds me of what the Heartland Institute's office. We're in the suburbs of Chicago right now, but for a long time, for most of our 40 years of existence, we had offices in downtown Chicago. And one day I was coming back from lunch and I was trying to walk into the building and there were a bunch of people laying on the sidewalk. And I wondered, what the hell is going on? Why are they doing that? They were conducting a die-in to protest the Heartland Institute's position on climate policy, because we were going to kill them and all of their progeny and everybody else on Earth because we didn't buy into the climate alarmist narrative. I just stepped over them and went back up to the 28th floor and got on with my day. But hey, well, Marc Morano is going to comment on this. Andy, if we want to play the video that we have of that climate funeral, I think it's quite the sight to see, especially some of those signs that are being carried around. So, Mark, you ever been to one of these?
Not a climate funeral. I've been to I feel like I've been seen similar at UN summits they've had, but not with coffins. I haven't seen.
I mean, I think the bagpiper is a nice cut. You know,
It's very
as an
nice
Irishman, I admire that.
Except Scotland right now is going through a very, very cold summer, so I'm surprised they could get a Scot to do something.
They're such cowards wearing sackcloth over their normal clothes.
There you
You're
go.
supposed to wear it against your skin so it's painful. The fools.
Posers, complete posers for sure. I mean, gosh.
Well, I think it shows that they have no respect for the climate. When I go to a funeral, I dress in a suit, not
Yeah.
sackcloth.
That's right. Yeah, your flip flop there.
Yeah. Well, actually, maybe Mark and you guys can speak to this. I mean, it's not as if these things just spontaneously sprout out of the ground like a mushroom after a rain. You know, the environmental left and the activists, all these organizations are supremely well funded and organized, as opposed to climate realism, which is populated by normal people who have normal lives and things to do.
Yes.
So, you know, it seems like we're always, our side is always having to fight these well-funded professional agitators and loons.
Yeah, well, one of the things I like to point out is if you look at like Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, these are as deluded and wacky as these individuals are who get arrested and spray paint and just, you know, vandalize the Mona Lisa or disrupt traffic or interrupt a football game or spray paint a building. They are literally the spokesman for our ruling class governing elite. Hollywood directors give them millions. The Getty Foundation, I think the Rockefellers, Eileen Getty, of course, is one of the biggest funders of these. They are the voice of our ruling class. And how can you prove that beyond the money trail? Listen to what they say. They sound like Al Gore. They sound like the UN Secretary General. They sound like any average college professor with the climate tripe that they spew out. There's nothing interesting that they have to say. Well, we're in a climate emergency, blah, blah, blah. And they actually pathetically think, well, I'm sticking it to the man by being here. And it's like, no, you're not sticking it to the man. You're the spokesman for the man with this kind of crap. And the same here. I don't exactly know who funds. I mean, Bill McKibben, a lot of shadowy money. He was actually made fun of by Michael Moore in his film Planet of the, what was it? I can't remember now. I want to say Planet of the Progressives, but that's not.
Planet of the Humans.
Planet of the Humans.
Planet of the Humans. Yeah, he was exiled from Planet of the Progressives for that movie. But in the movie, they have Bill McKibben unsure of who funds him. He doesn't know. He can't answer any of the most basic questions. They sort of go after him in that film. Well, this thing with Citibank, of course, is part of a larger issue. They want to turn this into sort of this tobacco settlement. It's a shakedown of corporate America. So the idea of doing this funeral is silly on one hand, but I just wanted to read you a couple of their actual claims. If you read the tombstones, this is hilarious. This is the proof that they have why Citibank is liable for people dying. One tombstone reads, man found in car on hot day, window rolled down, flat tire, heat death. That's what you're supposed to look at and say, oh my God, Citibank. And then here's another one. The other one is about a lady hiking with her husband. Here it is. 44-year-old woman dies of heat stroke while hiking with her husband and 2 children in Sedona. That's Citibank's fault. That's why Citibank needs to pay up. That's why all of corporate America needs to pay up if they're financing any fossil fuels. This is truly, just beyond bonkers. But this is a message that the ruling class likes because it's creating the chaos and it's advancing their agenda.
Remind me, Sedona. That's like Norway, right?
I think it's Arizona.
No, I'm kidding. Yeah, it's not some Nordic country. It's a desert. It's in the desert of Arizona. It's a beautiful place, but it is not a place that you go hiking merrily without lots of water and letting people know where you're at. every year people die there in the
And
summer.
you also have a thing called a weather forecast. If you know it's going to be a really hot day, take precautions. It's not like it surprises you.
Yeah.
Right. Well, actually, Mark, what you just brought up there is a perfect segue to my second crazy climate news of the week. And it's not exactly news. It's not exactly new, but I did find it again through the great climatedepot.com. And it is, let's see, it's a story that is headlined "Calls to Add Climate Change to Death Certificates. New study demands climate change be added as a pre-existing condition." Now, this was a study, as you explained there, published in the prestigious journal, The Lancet, in 2020 by 2 PhDs, lamenting that, quote, "climate change is a killer, but we don't acknowledge it on death certificates." Says one of the authors, quote, "We can make a diagnosis of disease like coronavirus, but we are less literate in environmental determinants like hot weather or bushfire smoke. So, quote, if you have an asthma attack and die during heavy smoke exposure from bushfires, the death certificate should include that information." Now, guys, I think if you give yourself an aneurysm, for instance, because you're falsely and tragically worried out of your mind that this planet is about to be uninhabitable by 2021, that might be a death attributable to not climate change, but climate panic. Maybe it's just climate adjacent. I don't know. This idea of putting climate change on death certificates, this is actually going to segue again into one of the items on climate lawfare that's coming up. Who wants to jump in on that one?
Well, I would say, so they mentioned brush fires, right? The smoke from brush fires. And they mentioned, what was the other thing they mentioned as a possible example?
Let's see. Oh, hot weather and brush fire smoke. Yeah.
So, okay. So we never had brush fires before there was so-called climate change. People never died from smoke inhalation. People never had heat stroke before we had climate. I acknowledge that on death certificate you could be able to say heat stroke, but you shouldn't be able to say it's climate because it existed before climate. There's no evidence climate change has changed any of that. They're trying to make a weather-related death into a climate-related death, and they're two different things.
Well, it's not even just that it's a climate-related death. It's that it's a human-caused climate change-related death. In other words, that human emissions of carbon dioxide is what is causing more intense heat waves, more brush fires, and the research and the things we cover on the Climate Realism Show and the stuff that Marc Morano posts on climatedepot.com debunk all of this garbage, because human activity is not changing the climate in ways that would make these things more severe, and certainly not severe enough to put it on someone's death certificate, Mark.
Yeah. And what's funny about this is this was right after March of 2020. They did this study in the journal Lancet after the COVID lockdowns began and the whole idea of COVID death counts and everything else. So this was the beginning of the movement. Now, I always say at first the climate activists were jealous of the COVID lockdown, saying, hey, that's what we want. And then shortly after they recovered and said, we won in. That's why you had like Teen Vogue magazine saying, if we can shut down the world for a virus, we can do the same thing for climate change. Remember, it was during COVID that they got to shut down the economy, which is what climate wanted to do for years with the degrowth movement, with planned recessions to fight climate change. They even got to have kids skip school, which is what Greta wanted to do. Well, they got to do that when COVID hit. So there was all that. So this was part of the modeling. So this study, adding climate change as a cause on your death certificate, is a way to start what? Climate death counts. Same time, a year later, the doctor in British Columbia, the head of the emergency room, and then a group of doctors were formed after this, was the first doctor to medically diagnose a patient as suffering from climate change. He actually wrote it on her chart. It was a woman who was suffering from heat stroke, and he put down, your condition is climate change. So you can actually get diagnosed by a doctor now with climate change. You can have it added as a cause of death on your death certificate. And the Harvard Law Review, just I guess it was a little over a year ago, had a study claiming, the Harvard Environmental Law Review, saying that there's a climate homicide is something we should be pursuing, because all these people are dying. You need lawsuits, which is what we're going to get into, I think, with the next story on the Lawfare. And the bottom line with all of this is modeled after the tobacco industry, and this is all part of merging climate change into a public health threat. That's why you had 200 medical journals saying climate is a public health threat. That's why you have the Harvard School of Medicine claiming unchecked climate change leads to more COVID-like viruses. So if you don't support the Green New Deal, you're a grandma killer. So this death certificate thing that you touched on here is just the tip of the iceberg that puts in this whole big picture of what's not only what they want to do, but what they're actually doing. And by the way, the federal agency of the Obama administration is going to start counting heat wave deaths. We're not far from the day where CNN is going to say, like, summer heat wave, Adelia has now killed 400 people. The death toll rises. Did they die with climate change or because of climate change? That's what we'll be asking ourselves.
Well, the question they could ask, and Sterling, I'm sure can jump to this. So if they're going to be counting heat-related deaths, are they going to be counting cold-related deaths? Because the data shows that more people die from cold than heat, and it's not a close call.
Yeah, no, 10 to 17 times more people die from cold than heat. And the thing is, they won't acknowledge that cold deaths are going down in part due to the modest warming, not solely, but in part. But when people do die during cold weather, they still like to blame climate change. Like, oh, if the snow hadn't fallen so much, if it hadn't been so extremely cold, we had a polar vortex blow in. Oh, it's climate change. So you remember, climate change is the cause that never has to say it's sorry because it can't be wrong. It is the end all and be all. It defies logic. It can be colder than average or warmer than average, evidently at the same place at the same time. It defies physics. So,
well, the alarmists do tell a love story of death when it comes to climate alarmism. I think about 6 people of the 500 watching will get that reference, but thanks to Sterling. So, all right. But appreciate that, guys. Yes. And so let's, there's just one more thing I wanted to share, and then a pretty funny cartoon that Anthony shared with us before he left. A friend of yours, Mark, and mine, and well, everybody on this podcast, and many of the people watching, I'm sure. Steve Malloy, he tweeted out something that went very viral for Twitter X. A tweet that says 91 years of global warming down the drain. June 2024 U.S. max temps cooler than June 1933, despite many emissions and much urban heat island effect. Ask a climate hoaxer to explain that. And what's crazy about it is that this tweet was viewed 1 million times. And when I took the screen cap in just 24 hours, and that's the second time Steve Malloy at junkscience.com has pulled off that trick. But I don't think Elon Musk had anything to do with this one. He didn't retweet it. So kudos to Steve. Linnea, you're on Twitter. You have your Twitter handle up there.
Yep.
I'm sorry, X handle up there at Linnea Lueken. This is something that, guys like Chris Martz, who we had on this program a while back, Matthew Wylicki, who we've also had on the program in the past and hope to have on again. X is becoming a platform thanks to Elon Musk purchasing it and making it a private company again. And he refuses to be swayed by the government censors and the climate alarmists and allows people to speak their minds. And in this case, speak the scientific truth that that it was hotter in the 1930s in June in the United States than it was in supposedly the hottest summer in 120,000 years.
Yeah, of course. This is one of the funniest things that Steve regularly does is use the exact same kind of arguments that the alarmists, especially the very poorly informed alarmists, tend to use, which is this month was hotter than average according to some arbitrary length of time. And then of course, and then he can pull the same card here where he goes and pulls that this is actually cooler than it was 100 years of warming ago, right? So it cracks me up every time because it drives them absolutely ballistic. It makes them go completely insane in his comments. And this is the kind of stuff that people enjoy. I think especially it's not just about the factual presentation of the actual data here. It is also that it's kind of poking in the eye of the alarmists, right? Because it's funny. And that's part of what Chris Martz does too. That's so successful and so great. Mm-hmm. I do want to point out, though, that I'm still a little bit mad at Elon when it comes to X, because the Heartland Institute's Twitter account still can't be searched. Like, I have to, in order for me to find the Heartland, it doesn't come across my feed. In order for me to type it into their search and then click on like your account or another account that links back to the Heartland Institute account, it's still shadow banned. So he's got to get on that for us.
Are you listening, Elon? I know you're listening, Elon. He'll get on that right away for sure. All right. And then this one last quick item shared with us by Anthony Watts before he took the week off. This is a cartoon from Scott Adams, famous, of course, as the creator of Dilbert. This is from his new web comic strip, Robots Read News, and is a commentary on our always wrong corrupt media. Do you remember us telling you for the past 4 years that Biden's brain was better than ever? Oh, I just figured he couldn't shake his cold. In our defense, there were no clear signs of any kind of mental decline. It was hidden. I mean, once you point it out, sure. But the climate crisis is still totally real. You'll be dead by Tuesday. What? Even if I recycle? That's right. Even if you recycle. So there you have it. That's for you, Anthony Watts. I know you're watching or will be watching later. Salute you. All right. On to our main topic, and that is climate lawfare. To be honest, I asked when Sterling had proposed this as our topic today, I was like, is there really any new climate lawfare stuff? And I thought we were kind of winning. I thought climate lawfare was fizzling out. And as we had to make the title of this podcast today, climate lawfare really is heating up. And I want to start with one of the recent stories here that is actually the most serious. And then we'll get down to maybe, I don't know, less serious things. And that's a story from The Hill, where a prosecutor outlines the homicide case against Big Oil. Let's see here. Yep, there we go. So last summer, says the story, last summer, an unusually long and brutal heat wave killed hundreds of people in Maricopa County, Arizona. That's in the Phoenix area. Quote, far more than all the murders the county experienced that year. Former federal prosecutor Cindy Cho wrote on Wednesday. These deaths range from homeless to the wealthy, elderly people at home to a 31-year-old engineer who died on a hike. And while tragic, Cho argued that these deaths were not accidental, but the result of a reckless action by a clear perpetrator, the fossil fuel industry. Linnea, you are a former petroleum engineer, so you should pay attention. This is very important news for you and very grim. The memo, which Cho prepared for civil society group Public Citizen, comes on the heels of a push by congressional Democrats for federal prosecution of oil companies for alleged price fixing and what Democrats view as their role in covering up the climate crisis, something that one former federal prosecutor told Congress was analogous to criminal racketeering by the tobacco industry. And you just mentioned that earlier, Marc Morano. Just a little bit more here. But whatever decision federal prosecutors make, Cho argued, local prosecutors like those in Maricopa County have their own clear pathway for prosecution for second-degree murder. Second-degree murder. This memo focuses on, quote, 8 of the world's largest investor-owned fossil fuel companies and a national oil and gas trade association. Each of these, Cho argued, quote, are collectively responsible for a substantial portion of all global greenhouse emissions that are actively participated in a conspiracy to spread climate disinformation. I mean, I could read more. You can read this for yourself in the show notes. But guys, I don't know about you, but the concept of collective guilt seems a little un-American to me. It seems, what's that word the left uses all the time? Oh, fascist. That's right. Fascist. And I'm going to get out of the way here before I get myself into even more trouble. Sterling, why don't you get yourself in trouble?
I got 2 thoughts. First off, I guess I'm looking forward to seeing Linnea in a blaze orange jumpsuit onesie or black and white stripes like from the old 30s and 50s films, her present attire, because she did work for the industry. Secondly, you know, in the criminal law, I'm not a lawyer, but I watch enough of them on TV. As I understand it, in the criminal law, there must be a direct connection, you know, something clear beyond a reasonable doubt that X actor they're not talking about civil suits here, right? Civil suits is preponderance of the evidence. You weigh relative benefits and costs and contributions. In the criminal laws, X caused Y beyond a reasonable doubt. You'd have to prove to me that any executive at Exxon caused any individual identifiable death. That's what it means. You have to point to the person, be able to prove that they were caused by the emissions from that executive's company, and they can't do it. That's impossible as a matter of criminal law. That doesn't mean they won't try. That doesn't mean that the court system might, with a wink and a nod, say, oh, well, it's just, it's so bad that we've got to do something, even though, let's face it, the courts, well, I won't go into. Some of the courts have been better than others on this, but I don't know any of them that have said we can breach the criminal law like this.
Yeah, Mark, I want to throw it to you. I mean, the topic of this. Actually, I've known you for a long time. You're not an attorney, are you? You can say yes. It won't make me think any less of you, but
no,
you're
I'm
not.
I might play one on TV, but no.
Okay, all right. But this kind of lawfare. I mean, I know you have had, you've had a lot of great personal attacks against you, and I'm sure that there are, let's just say, Obama era former U.S. attorneys who would love to prosecute a case against organizations like CFACT. Go to cfact.org to learn more about that, and the Heartland Institute, and Linnea, and Sterling, and anybody really who dares to challenge the false climate narrative of human-caused fossil fuel burned CO2 emissions causing not just a climate catastrophe, but direct deaths to people for which a second-degree murder charge would be warranted.
Yeah, well, this is okay. I mentioned earlier about the Biden administration. This was according to NBC News about 8 months ago. The White House is planning on unveiling a national dashboard for tracking heat-related illnesses nationwide due to the growing impacts of climate change. So they want to have that death count. Now, this story you read and mentioning Maricopa County, this was picked up. Public Citizen and a former federal prosecutor named Cindy Cho is now coming out saying second-degree murder prosecutions against big oil for the heat waves death. And it's basically the same story. But the key to this is they're using these climate models, and the evidence that they use by Public Citizen is, according to this latest climate model study, in quotes, this heat wave in Arizona would have been, virtually impossible without mankind's contribution to CO2. That's their hard science. That's their story. That's what they're sticking to. And as we mentioned, they're ignoring the fact that cold deaths are higher, much higher, 8 to 20 times higher than warm deaths. They're forgetting the fact that there's been a 99% drop in climate-related deaths over the last 100 years, probably mostly in part due to fossil fuels and the technological revolution and the infrastructure you build up. And instead, they're just looking to shake down companies. And I wouldn't be surprised if big oil capitulates to this at some point, because they don't seem to have that many principles. If they think it could get them off the hook, they probably would agree to some settlement. And of course, it wouldn't end. There's no criteria by which you could ever say, well, we have enough money or we've solved climate change, therefore we don't need to prosecute this. But remember, this goes back to academia. Over a year ago, Harvard Environmental Law Review actually said the phrase climate homicide needs to be introduced as a legal principle. And this is where we're headed. This is a shakedown. Make no mistake about it. You're driving that SUV caused this storm. You eating hamburgers caused it. You keeping your air conditioner too cold. And I hope, Sterling, that you have your air conditioner at the federal guideline of 78. I think it's 78 in the day and 82 at night Fahrenheit. I hope you're sticking straight to that.
You hope in vain. That's not where my air conditioning is set. But we didn't talk about what lawfare is. It's the use of the courts to try and extort concessions. They can't go through the messy process. They keep saying, "Oh, we're champions of democracy. We're fighting fascism." Democracy is you go to the legislature and you convince enough legislators to pass a law. This is the use of courts to circumvent the law in the legislature. And this would be a bastardization of the criminal law. I mean, it's bad enough that they're using torts to try and extort concessions. If Exxon says, okay, I'm just willing to pay you off, how much will it take to get you out of my business in a tort lawsuit? That's one thing. I don't think any of those executives is willing to go to jail. I think they'll fight. Homicide, second-degree homicides, 20 years to life in most jurisdictions. So I don't think the head of Exxon is going to give up on this one. Or the head of Chevron. This would be a bastardization of the criminal law. And if you can do it to Exxon, what is to stop them from doing it to you, me, or even the attorney himself who's taking that case to court, right? Driving his SUV, or if the Manhattan DA, a stretch limo, who is immune? And then it would not just be climate. It would be any other thing that they could say deaths resulted from this. And had this industry not been doing, the agriculture industry, well, people wouldn't be having heart attacks if they weren't growing meat, if they weren't raising cattle and doing dairy. We know that's bad for you. So they're killing people. We got to go after them next. It's meat homicide.
Yeah.
And of course the Smiths, meat is murder. They did that 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But the point is, it will take all meaning out of the criminal law. It will done the separation between criminal and tort law, and it will end modern civilization, because no one will be able to do anything without fear that they will then be blamed for homicide, because something that can't be proven, but more importantly, it can't be disproven. How can Exxon disprove that its emissions didn't cause? That's their whole point.
The only counter I have to that is, if you browbeat an industry enough and you threaten them, I'm not saying they'll ever going to face, I don't think they'll actually realistically ever be faced with a climate second-degree murder charge. But if we have say Biden wins, and look what they did with EVs. They have, you have all these EV automakers going against their own interests. That's because these are the regulators forcing it on them. You have the World Bank, Nicholas Stern, former president, saying we're not going to finance these car loans. You have the bank saying we're not going to finance gas-powered cars at the automaker level. You have banks saying we're not going to give out gas-powered car loans to consumers. You have cities banning creation of new gas stations. When they put the fix in, they can put the pressure on. So what I'm saying is, if Biden comes out with a heat wave death count, public health merges climate successfully, if the World Health already has the climate toolkit for doctors, and they start fingering these increasing unprecedented health heat deaths, and then you have prosecutors, state attorney generals, you're going to have federal regulators if Biden wins again, going after these companies. At some point they might say, hey, it's cheaper to pay some kind of settlement figure modeled after like tobacco than to deal with all this, with all these laws and coming after us. Because when they get the fix in, they can make a pretty incessant and nonstop case to go after an industry, and that's what they're good at. And that's why I think they could get some money out of industry from this, even if it's much smaller. But I don't think they're ever really intending to go through with the threat of charging them successfully with second-degree climate murder. But it's a tool to browbeat them and to shake it down for money.
Yeah. Well, I mean, criminal prosecution, not off the table, not necessarily going to happen. But here we got another story here from the Telegraph via Yahoo News. Climate campaigners bombard courts with action against oil execs. Climate campaigners are bombarding the courts with lawsuits against energy companies in a new attempt to end the use of fossil fuels. A report from the London School of Economics has found there are 132 climate cases in the British legal system at present. The LSE found, up from 102 a year ago. It makes this country, England, the third highest center for climate litigation in the world after, shocker, the United States, and a little surprising, Australia. And the LSE suggested this year that it will set a new record for the number of cases, with a further wave of action expected as environmental lawyers increasingly pioneer new legal concepts such as ecocide. And their aim is to tie up oil and gas company executives with legal action or even trials over accusations that the emissions of their products killed people. Much like Linnea, I think I'll go to you on this if you like. The as somebody who's a former employee of an oil company, a petroleum engineer, they're targeting your former industry, I should say, with as many lawsuits as possible. Flood the zone so that to be as annoying as possible, to be as expensive as possible, and to, death by 1,000 cuts, I suppose, is what they're going for. And that the process, much like when Michael Mann sued Mark Stein, it's the process that's the punishment. They might not even really think or believe that they will be successful, because a lot of the lawsuits are very frivolous just on first examination. But it's the process that is supposed to punish, people that are actually providing not just a valuable service to the world, but the most valuable service and product that humanity has ever known.
Right. And I would love to say that I feel bad for these companies, but I actually don't at all. They've been setting themselves up for this for decades at this point. If you go right now to ExxonMobil's website, and I checked this while we were talking here just to make sure that they haven't changed anything, but it's still the case. And it's actually even more extreme than it was last time I checked it a couple of weeks ago. ExxonMobil's front page is all about reducing carbon emissions. That is their main thrust of their website design right now, is sustainability and reducing emissions, reducing methane emissions. The API, which I think is the organization that's also being sued, the American Petroleum Institute, has been advertising on their website about how good they are about emissions, or how they're lobbying for methane regulations and stuff. What do you mean? I thought, if your product isn't hurting the planet, then why are you advertising about reducing the use of your product? And also I made this point to someone at the conference I went to this week, but when I was working in the industry, if I thought that the product that I was helping to produce was destroying the planet, I would not be working in that industry. I wouldn't be able to do it. And yet there are people in the industry at high levels that are shilling climate change nonsense, or the climate catastrophe narrative, while also working to produce more of the product that they claim is destroying the planet. So are they evil or stupid? I don't know. But
I always embrace the power of "and." Don't discount "and." That's the way I always think about it.
I'm so mad at it's one of my favorite op-eds I ever wrote was for Human Events, and it was where I pointed out all of the sections on BP and Exxon and all these organizations' websites shilling the climate catastrophe narrative, and then they're gonna complain and cry and especially ask these smaller industry, or these smaller companies and smaller industries that they've been screwing over by lobbying for methane emissions regulations for years now, and they're going to ask them to help them prepare to defeat these lawsuits. No.
It's no longer it's no longer
you
with
made
Exxon.
your bed.
It's
I'm
no
mad
longer,
at them.
It's no longer with Exxon, put a Tiger in your tank. It's now put a carbon capture and storage unit in your tank.
Right.
God, you're right. They have long led to their doom. Remember, first the first fossil fuel they threw under the bus was coal, right? Natural gas said, "Oh, yeah, you're right. Coal is terrible. It's causing emissions. It's climate change." But natural gas is a transition fuel. We're so much cleaner. So
imagine describing your product that way. My product is a transition product.
Yeah,
you're going to stop using this soon.
Yeah, we're transitioning you from a fast death to a slower death.
Right.
We're going to, what is it? The guy that they said, someone asked him, "Have you stopped beating your wife?" And he says, "Oh, well, I'm doing it less than I used to, and I expect in the future to stop altogether." Sorry, that's not sufficient.
Yeah. Well, Marc Morano, I mean, this actually what Linnea had described there, and how fortuitous again for her to look at the Exxon website to confirm what she knew in her heart to be true, because we all know this. And it is that big oil gave up on supporting climate realism a long time ago. And that it goes without saying that big oil does not contribute to organizations like CFACT and the Heartland Institute and the CO2 Coalition and a lot of our other allies in the climate realism movement. They long ago sold out to the green gravy train. And I'll never forget that I remember seeing a British Petroleum BP commercial on TV where the logo swirled and then the words "Beyond Petroleum" came out. For a petroleum company, for crying out loud, Marc Morano.
Yeah, in fact, when I was in the U.S. Senate, it was, I want to say, it was a Rockefeller senator from West Virginia, and maybe it was Dianne Feinstein or Boxer who did this impassioned letter to ExxonMobil. But here's the thing. Even when ExxonMobil gave to skeptic groups back in the 90s and up to, I guess, early 2000s, it was actually to general conservative groups in general who maybe 5%, 2% was dealing with climate. It wasn't specifically to deny climate change. And what's interesting is that Union of Concerned Scientists, this was back 20 years ago now, did a study claiming ExxonMobil gave, 16 or 17 million to groups skeptical of climate change since the early 1990s, like over 2 decades. One United States Department of Agricultural farm grant for $20 million exceeded all the money ExxonMobil was ever accused of giving to climate skeptics. And this farm grant was to study global warming, farm odors on global warming. So it just goes to show you what a pittance, first of all, big companies like ExxonMobil ever even gave. It didn't even equal one USDA farm grant. Secondly, when you look at the big picture, there's people always say, oh, that's ExxonMobil talking point. What? ExxonMobil was Rex Tillerson, probably one of Trump's worst cabinet picks, and that's saying something.
Yeah.
One of his first acts was going to the Arctic to sign the UN climate declaration. He supported carbon taxes. He supported the UN Paris Agreement. All a big oil does. So the whole concept of this is, why would they give us money when we're actively opposed to all that? And they love all these rules because it crushes the smaller competition. They have the best lawyers and lobbyists. They get the best deals. They get to absorb all the smaller companies that can't afford the climate compliance costs. Same reason a lot of big companies supported Obamacare, healthcare. It's always the big players that love more government because they can manipulate the government to their interests the best.
Yeah. 100%.
I just want to ask, a thought occurs to me every time I see another lawsuit filed, because what they say in England, 160 something cases. I'll wager there's probably 500 or more in the U.S. right now, including the states, the cities, the children, the interest groups. If they never pay out a dime, if they don't lose a single case ever in any of these court cases, I wonder how many billions or hundreds of billions of dollars they spend just fighting these things. And I can't help but wonder what better uses those resources could have been put to, either for energy efficiency, better refining technologies, better production, different alternative energy technologies, or just return to their shareholders in profits so that they can make their own decisions about where to spend the money and what they're concerned about. I mean, the vast waste of resources in fighting these lawsuits. I understand why they're fighting them. I want them to fight them. I wish they fought them on the science. But even if they never lose, society has lost.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So I want to get to a couple more lawsuits here real quick before we take it to questions, because we always love the Q&A from the chat here on our live stream. And this is something that I would say close to your heart, Sterling, but I think it's more close to the spot in your body that it holds all of your annoyance, and it's probably closer to Linnea's heart. And it's climate youth lawsuits. Yeah, our favorites right here. So we got one here from the Associated Press in Hawaii. So apparently Hawaii settles lawsuit from use over climate change. And here's what to know about the historic deal. After about 2 years, 13 children and teens sued Hawaii over the threat posed by climate change. And both sides reached a settlement that includes an ambitious requirement to decarbonize the state's transportation system over the next 21 years. It's another example of a younger generation channeling their frustration with the government's response to the climate crisis into a legal battle. I guess this is when you take brainwashing and indoctrination into court. This is what you end up with. So apparently they're going to decarbonize the public transportation system in Hawaii. Well, the weather's usually so nice, people should probably be walking anyway or on little scooters. So that may not have a huge, huge deal. Second story here is Montana Supreme Court hears arguments held in, Montana Supreme Court hears arguments in held youth climate lawsuit. Wednesday, that was just this week, 2 days ago, marked the long-awaited next step in a lawsuit that challenged the state of Montana over climate change. The lawsuit, Held versus Montana, drew a ton of attention when it was heard in a state district court last year. The pattern continues as justices of the Montana Supreme Court heard oral arguments Wednesday in Helena. The chamber was already full 45 minutes before the arguments began, and dozens more people watched the live stream in the overflow next door. And the Held case, which started back in 2020, when 16 young plaintiffs between the ages of 5 and 22 filed suit against the state. They claim Montana's policies on greenhouse gas emissions were contributing to the climate change and harming their right to, quote, a clean and healthful environment. And Sterling, you follow these cases quite a bit. You write about them a lot in the Heartland Institute's Climate Change Weekly newsletter, which you can subscribe to by going to heartland.org. It's a great weekly roundup of sometimes nutty stories like this, but you do cover pretty closely these sorts of climate lawsuits. Why don't you take it from the Montana one and this idea of getting children to be just like Greta, right? Just like Greta, using children as the vehicle for these sorts of nonsense.
Dozens of lawsuits like that. I think the first one arose out of Oregon. It's already gone to federal court twice and been knocked back. Hawaii's, I'm not surprised Hawaii, I wouldn't call it caved. I think they collaborated with the youth. They wanted to do stuff on climate change. I don't know how it's going to affect their tourism industry, but maybe the Hawaiians don't like tourists anymore because I assure you that we won't have jets in 2021 that are carbon neutral. Or I mean, in 21 years. But the Montana case is the only one of these cases that ever really worried me. And that's because Montana has a provision of its constitution guaranteeing its citizens the right to a clean and healthful environment. Now, I'm not sure how you do that since there are natural toxins and things, but it's in there. And so I always thought that that case had the most likelihood of being victorious. Now you have to define clean and healthful. You have to show, I think, that fossil fuel use is making it less clean and healthful and damaging their health. But the lower court held that they'd made that case. Now it has to go to the Supreme Court where, it's unclear to me whether they'll overturn that lower court's decision because it's not a matter of balancing the benefits of fossil fuels versus the potential harms if we can make that connection. Here they have a constitutional provision that says they get a clean and healthy environment, and it's just a matter of the courts deciding what a clean and healthy environment means. And if they think that fossil fuels dirty up the environment, then, so be it. That one's a dangerous case, but it's really relatively limited. Let's face it. It's not clear to me that they can sue anyone outside of Montana. And as much as I love Montana and I've lived there twice, if the emissions from Montana go away and all transportation in Montana goes electric and no one flies into Montana anymore or vacations there, and those who live there can't get from their ranches downtown to the grocery store, it will be a bad thing, but the United States will not fall.
Yeah. All right. Let me throw one more case here, and then maybe Mark can weigh in a little bit, and then we'll get to Q&A. And that is Sterling. You shared this with me, and it's supposedly good news.
Yep.
And that is from the Baltimore Sun, actually from Forbes. You sent me the Baltimore Sun link. That's behind a paywall, Sterling. I am not going to spend a thin dime giving money to the mainstream media. Sorry, I had to find it elsewhere.
Yeah.
But the story reads, BP wins key ruling in city of Baltimore climate change lawsuit. In a ruling that could impact, if we're lucky, dozens of legal actions in what has become a coordinated lawfare effort to damage the U.S. oil and gas industry, a city circuit judge in Baltimore, Maryland, tossed out a local government's lawsuit that sought to hold oil companies financially liable for alleged impacts of climate change. on Thursday. The opinion begins with the judge affirmatively stating, in her view, that there is no question that global warming and climate change are wreaking havoc on our environment. However, the lawsuit goes beyond the limits of Maryland's state law. And then, there's other cases like this around the country where cities are suing big oil for supposedly rising seas, washing out beaches or sidewalks or whatever. I know, Mark, you look at this stuff too, but color me shocked that a judge in the United States of America, who is at heart a climate alarmist, nonetheless applies the actual law to a case like this and doesn't just rule what they think in their heart they know to be true.
Democratic judge, by the way.
Crisis.
A Democratic judge, by the way.
Yeah, of course.
It's impressive, actually, because that's never usually doesn't stop them from ever imposing what they believe should happen. And this is a lot of these cases are just extrapolate beyond whatever the law says because they want to get to that goal. And this, in the case of this Baltimore thing, this is just another example of trying to blame any bad weather. What they say is climate change will cause many bad weather events. And when something bad happens, they say, we told you so, see, and you're still using fossil fuels. We have to go after these people. It's insane because you could actually, and you guys know this better than anyone, scientifically say hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, wildfires, droughts, none of them, if you look at the peer-reviewed study of a climate time scales, 30, 50, 100 years, either no trend, declining trend, nothing unprecedented happening. So it's complete scientific nonsense from the beginning. But then the other key thing to mention here, Jim, this is important, especially going back to the Hawaii lawsuit. Mm-hmm. The legislators not involved. This is the Hawaiian, this would be the government and prosecutors agreeing with these kids to then impose these new things as their court ordered. Remember, the court's ordering this, so you don't have to vote on it. You don't need democracy. Similar things happen when, like in Netherlands, when the prime minister would go and agree to a UN climate summit net zero, and then the courts would order the farmers, the nitrogen bans on farmers, and then the farmers fought back. They're looking for all kinds of layers of coverage, and they're looking for ways to bypass democracy. And these lawsuits offer a great way to, quote, settle your way to bypass democracy for legislation that you probably couldn't get right away. And that's why these lawsuits are important, in addition, of course, to the financial shakedown element.
Right. I mean, that's the title of this podcast. Climate Lawfare heats up. And frankly, these sorts of questions need to be settled in the political realm, not in the judicial realm. And it needs to be based on hearings where, for instance, there's a balanced presentation of the science instead of just one way. And so, that's what Marc Morano's been doing for his professional life as a job ever since he was with the great Senator Jim Inhofe, and now with ClimateDepot.com, and of course the great CFACT, one of our best friends here in this movement. All right,
that's by the way what this judge ruled. That's what this judge ruled. It says this belongs in the political realm, and in particular the federal political realm.
Correct.
The feds make energy policy. It's for the feds to decide this, not a state court.
But one side of this debate is very impatient, very, very impatient. It's kind of their defining characteristic, to be honest. All right, it is one of our favorite parts of the program, and that is Q&A time. And Linnea has been monitoring the chat here on YouTube mostly, and I think there's a few people on Rumble who are also leaving some comments. So Linnea, let's get to it.
Sure thing. I have not seen questions come across Rumble. I have seen comments. If you have a link, Jim, that shows questions coming in from Rumble, if you would shoot it to me, that'd be good, because I'd like to make sure we get them too, in case they're not coming across our live feed here on StreamYard. First question that we got today, though, was this one from Diane Selby, who's a pretty regular viewer. She says, mainstream media is focused on the number of heat deaths experienced right now across the USA. Can you show data again that shows a higher death rate from cold rather than hot? And we do have that data lurking somewhere, so we might have to spend a minute to bring it up. But yes, Diane, we would love to show that, because that is the case.
Go to Climate at a Glance. And look, we show data. We show the data and graphics. We didn't have it teed up. We didn't know this question would come, but we show the data and the graphics that show not only are heat deaths down, but deaths due to extreme weather are down.
Yeah, and not only that, but Biden's own EPA shows the heat waves were far worse in the 1930s. So much so that you have professors now wanting to eliminate the 1930s EPA heat wave data. So the idea that anything unprecedented now with heat is just not scientifically tenable. Ask the Biden administration's EPA about it.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, this chart is for total climate related deaths. This is including flood, drought, storms, extreme temperatures, in both hot and cold. But this at least shows that the trends overall have been greatly decreasing. But there was a study that was published in, I think, 2022, right, Sterling? In the Lancet.
There was a massive study published in 2015 and a second study published in 2022 that came to the same conclusion. One of them was 10 times more deaths from cold than heat, and deaths from temperatures were declining. And the second one was 17 times more deaths from cold than heat, and the deaths from temperatures were declining.
Yeah, I have here the Lancet study for UK 2000. Since 2000, 85 times more UK excess deaths due to cold than heat. 3 studies concluded the 21st century cold temperatures led to 7 times more deaths than the warm temps. And Bjorn Lomborg put it in very simple terms: global warming temperatures saves 166,000 lives each year, because heat deaths make up 1% of global fatalities a year, almost 600,000, but cold kills 8 times as many people, or 4.5 million. So that's the hard numbers, and that's all readily available. This is not in dispute. It's not like other people say, "Oh no, I have a study showing cold is much less killer than heat." Pretty much across the board. I've never seen anything else. So it's not a controversial claim, or it's easy to back up with multiple studies.
No one's ever come out and said, "Oh, you can't trust the Lancet on this stuff." The Lancet's a terrible journal. It's not peer reviewed. No one says that. To take a more recent example, recently, 1,300 people died during the Hajj when it was held recently. There were more than 2 million people there. In I believe it was 1920. So 124 years ago, 1,500 to 1,600 people died during the Hajj, and there were only 50,000 people there. Talk about the percentage of deaths per attendees. Massive difference. Imagine if there had been 2 million there back in 1920.
Can't go confusing people with facts and statistics like this, Sterling. Okay. We've got a comment actually from Doug Pollock, who's a great friend of ours. He goes to a lot of our conferences. He has a comment for you, Marc. He says, "Congratulations to Marc for the tremendous interview to a French media in Vienna, where he said everything without mincing words."
Oh yeah, Doug was there with us. That was at the Vienna Climate Conference, where we had John Clauser and James Taylor, your president, speak. It was I believe it was European public TV, and the film crew was from France. So we know what they're going to do with all this footage. It's obviously going to be very similar to if PBS, a public broadcast here in the U.S., did a story about climate deniers. But I had some fun with the interview. But of course, it'll probably end up on the cutting room floor, a lot of it. Who knows?
For sure. Okay, we have this question. This is Kite Man Music. He says, "Hi from England. A lot of viewers from here. Any comments on the heat wave situation at the moment?" I have heard from people over there in the UK that their news is telling them breathlessly every day that they're having the worst heat ever, while many of them have turned on heaters in their homes this early summer. So
maybe some isolated places. I know that Scotland has been in unusual cold. They got snow just last week. It's some of their resorts, or not resorts. What do they call them? I forget what they call their ski areas, but an Arctic cold wave is affecting Scotland. I can't speak for lower England, but nationally, worldwide, I mean, globally, yes, some places are setting records. Some places set records every year, just like some places set records for cold every year. But all the headlines don't point out the fact that more than 80% of, say, the U.S. isn't in a heat wave. So they're talking about just the 20%, and just the 20% where daily, not summer records, but daily records, not the maximum heat for the summer, but the record on a particular date was broken.
Right. And that's something, guys, that to our audience, I saw a few audience members say, well, we have been seeing breaking records here in California or here, wherever. A day-to-day climate record, I mean, if you wanted to, you could you could schedule it down to the hour, and then you would have even more records being broken all the time because you've just created a massive amount of data. And Mark, I know that you've fought this issue a bit too.
Yeah, I was going to say is your chance of winning the lottery is very low. The chance of someone somewhere winning the lottery is very high. And that's what basically when they say there's a record temperature broken, it's like, yeah, someone won the lottery too. There's always going to be temperatures breaking. I liken it to the casino promotion department. Everyone knows you go in a casino, you see the slot machine, see the photos of people holding up, I won 10,000, a big cardboard check. Someone else has $100,000 cardboard check, a 50. You walk around a casino and look at all their promotion. You start thinking, everyone's winning at slots. I have to play slots. They're paying out records amount. That's what the media does with heat waves. They ignore the fact that in the 1930s, we had much higher heat waves, 8 to 10 times higher based on the EPA heat wave index of the Biden administration, higher than the national climate. 1930s also show higher than in the national climate assessment. John Christie has done the analysis. 75% of heat temperature records were state high temperature records were broken before 1955. Every measure we can look at in the United States shows that we're not seeing anything like the past in heat waves. So of course, they're going to promote every broken record. And again, it's just like a casino. You get the impression that records are breaking everywhere. No, that's what happened. Records are always going to be broken somewhere, but you want to look at long-term climate timescale trends. And that's where the whole argument falls apart. Right.
Excellent. Okay, so next we have this one. I think there might be a little bit of a typo in this one, but I'm going to read it anyway. And we're going to try and figure out what our friend Peter here is asking. He says, "Hey guys, love the show, and I try to promote it. Lakely and Watts and the team are excellent. Will the US and EU have to cut even more emissions post Etna?" And I'm not sure what he means by Etna. Anyone?
Volcano? Is he saying that volcano gave so much emissions that now we have to cut even more to compensate because of that nature?
Oh, maybe that could be it.
I'm assuming that's what he means, but yeah, I mean, that, I don't know. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, if they're looking at a total accounting budget, whether it's volcanoes or oceans outgassing, whatever it is, they could claim, oh, well, we have to tighten up even more because we didn't expect that volcano to mess up the greenhouse gas, our carbon budget or our emission budget. Who knows what they'll come up with, but I'm sure they'll claim at the very least, it's more urgent than ever that you give up that gas-powered car and turn that thermostat warm in the summer.
Okay, awesome. All right. This one is from Leia. This is a two-parter, so I'm gonna kind of quickly review it. Seen and heard the chart that Noah and someone else were stating how many more hurricanes there are going to be in the U.S. this year, and how much worse right through the year. How can you know this is going to happen when they can't predict the weather accurately? Well, I would defend, because we have some friends of Climate Realism who work for the Hurricane Prediction Center, and it's not that modeling science and that technology is totally worthless. Like it's not that it's great, it's not perfect, it's not always going to give you any kind of precision, but the Hurricane Prediction Center does a pretty good job. They give you a range. Usually they're not going to say, there's going to be 25 hurricanes this year, count on it. They have been wrong in the past, but they go with what a lot of times the historical data suggests will probably happen. I'm gonna defend them, because it's the media that tends to take it and exaggerate it quite a bit, not so much the actual researchers on that end.
I'd like to see them every time they make a forecast. It'd be great. Maybe they do this. They open up and say, here's what we predicted last year. Here's what actually happened. Now we'll tell you what we think is going to happen next year. That would be incredible. Whenever anyone makes annual predictions, I always think they should open with how their prediction did for the previous year, or even previous 5 years, decade. And I don't know that enough people do that. And I'm not going to comment because I don't watch the hurricane forecast enough or see what they say closely enough to know if they actually do that. But I think that would be a good thing to start adding if they don't do it.
I mean, just in the past week, what I've seen about hurricanes is we still expect an above average season. They talk about Beryl being the first Cat 5 hurricane ever to form this early. But then they also say, but El Nino is off to a slow start. and that is keeping ocean temperatures cooler than they would otherwise be. So by the time late August, September comes, we'll get more, but it's not happening quite like we had said when we predicted just 2 months ago. In 2022, they predicted an above average year. We didn't get it. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. Like Linnea says, they give a range. But it's not set in stone. And whether you have an above average year or a below average year, it doesn't mean climate change had anything to do with it whatsoever. To make a climate connection, you need to see long-term trends in a direction. And that's what you don't have with hurricanes, with tornadoes, with, some trends that we do have, they're going down, not up. But you don't have any long-term increasing trend for any of these natural disasters that would, maybe indict climate change.
Right. Thank you. So we have a question. For some reason, our comments from Rumble are not quite working properly, but we do have a question, and someone donated $1 for us. This is from user Data12, and he asks, what would be the top 2 questions that could turn a court from supporting lawfare against states like Alaska and Montana and people like Mark Stein?
So what would repeat that part? What would be the key piece of evidence?
He says, what would be the top 2 questions that could turn a court from supporting lawfare against, let's say things like Alaska, Montana, and Mark Stein? So I'm guessing.
You mean like a scientific case, or it's not your legal jurisdiction, or the scientific case is absurd from beginning to end, whether the level of CO2 are historically low given the geologic history, nothing unprecedented is happening with the weather, no extreme weather increase. I mean, you could go through a litany. I don't know the top 2. Problem is, none of that's ultimately going to matter if you have an activist judge and you have weak the defense usually doesn't want to challenge any of the scientific claims. They're going to want to argue only on either jurisdiction, legal grounds. It's a huge advantage for the climate alarmists because they go in there with absurd scientific claims that are almost never refuted scientifically. A few exceptions. I think Montana actually did bring in a lot of scientists, but most of the time, even if there's like a Republican state, they're too timid to even come back and challenge any of the climate claims, scientific claims.
Yeah.
Actually, what happened? Go ahead,
I was going to say the 2 questions actually should occur during the confirmation process. Number 1, are you a climate alarmist?
Yeah.
Do you believe that humans are causing a climate catastrophe? Okay, I'm going to write that one down.
Yeah.
And do you believe that the Constitution means what it says? Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
You
move along.
In the Montana case, Mark, they had scientists lined up. They took their briefs, but then they disinvited them.
That's right. Okay, I remember that now. Yeah, so they never actually testified. Yeah.
So there's a problem there. Yeah, I don't know that there's 2 questions that would be definitive. I think the overall, the overarching theme for all these cases should be what level of government is specifically delegated and assigned the power to regulate interstate commerce. There is only one. That is the Congress of the United States, not a state court, not a state legislature, not federal courts. Congress of the United States regulates interstate commerce. And if anything is interstate and international commerce, it's oil and gas, it's energy. And so that should, the door to the courthouse should be closed to all these cases on that grounds alone. The court should say, you have no standing, take it to the U.S. Congress, who has the authority, the sole delegated authority to regulate interstate commerce. Now, we may not like what Congress comes up with, but that's why you vote. Right now, Congress has considered climate legislation a number of times. It's never enacted any. So I think that should be, every court should say, well, this is interstate commerce. Who regulates interstate commerce? The Constitution says the U.S. Congress does.
Thank you, Sterling. And I'm actually going to pitch this next question back to you, Sterling, because this is a subject that I think that you will answer very succinctly. And that is a question from our resident, I don't want to be mean to him and call him an alarmist, but he's at the very least very pro green energy guy. He says, do you think that wind and solar and battery backup will be cheaper than fossil fuels for electricity production without government subsidies? Question 2, is fossil fuels economics viable without subsidies?
The subsidies that fossil fuels get globally, and I hear a lot about this. Oh, they get far more, are not to the industry, but they're to retail. They're to you and I, not here in the U.S. The fossil fuel industry gets almost no subsidies in the U.S. But where my wife's from in Venezuela and in Saudi Arabia and other places, the consumers are subsidized. They sell gasoline to them at rates that are well below the market rate. They get their gasoline cheap. That's a subsidy to consumers, not to the industry. Concerning will wind and solar and battery backup be cheaper than fossil fuels on their own without subsidies? Well, I was told 20 years ago by people who are promoting the industry that they would be. They're still not. Battery backup rivals only offshore wind as the highest cost source of energy. So anytime you're going to move to that for backup, and I mean reliable long-term not 4 minutes on a grid, not 4 hours, but 24 hours if the wind goes down and you don't have enough solar, it will never be. I should never say never. Not in the foreseeable future. Wind and solar, and you know this every year, every time the subsidies for wind and solar, by subsidies I mean direct payments, the production tax credit and the property value tax credits go away at states or the federal level, the industry shuts down the next day. Factories are closed. They exist solely because of government subsidies, support, and mandates. And when those support and mandates go away, they will go away too, except for boutique uses. Look, someone in Montana that's not connected to the grid, a solar panel makes a lot of sense with diesel generator backup. But for Dallas, Texas, in the middle of summer, wind and solar don't make a lot of sense. You'd say, oh, why not solar? Well, I'll tell you, a lot of people don't know this. So temperatures in Dallas routinely are above 100 degrees. When you get above a certain temperature on solar panels, they start to lose efficiency pretty radically. The way the electrons work don't work as well. And so you lose power there. The wind in West Texas isn't blowing. It doesn't make sense. But we pay more for gas because, well, it has to switch on and off for when the wind does blow. So you got to pay for it when it's there. They got to ramp it up. I don't see them being in my lifetime. Who knows how many years I have left, less than I've seen already, being cost competitive with fossil fuels, absent subsidies and mandates. And the subsidies for fossil fuels in the U.S. almost non-existent. Most of it's going to carbon capture.
Right, that's true, Sterling. That's something that a lot of people don't point out, is that pretty much all of and that we did a deep dive into this because the EIA releases these statistics yearly, I'm pretty sure. We looked into exactly where the direct subsidies to fossil fuels went, and it was all for carbon capture. It was all for So it's kind of a trick question there. Okay, so we have a final question, but I'm actually combining two people's questions. And Mark, I'm going to pitch it to you. The first question, or the first part of this combined question, comes from Chris Nisbet, who says, do courts understand that fossil fuels have made it possible for humans to protect themselves against bad weather? And then the second is from Slarta Bartfast, whose name I always stumble over. And he asks, how many lives have fossil fuels saved? Heating, air conditioning, ambulances, fire brigade, etc.
Yeah, well, that's one of the funny things. If you, again, the 99% drop in climate-related deaths is due in large part to fossil fuel technology and the building of the infrastructure made possible with fossil fuels. I think it was Alex Epstein who says it most eloquently. We've taken an unsafe climate and made it safe for humans. That's what fossil fuel development did. So, that's one of the reasons you have the 99% drop in death. And just in terms of fossil fuels, they have been one of the greatest liberators in mankind in the history of our planet. Long life, lower infant mortality, modern dentistry, cleaner air, cleaner water. Yes, you go through a period of rapid industrialization, and then eventually you get to the point where wealth, prosperity, technology take over, and you can have, like the United States does, according to the World Health Organization, among the cleanest air in the world and the cleanest environments in the world. And that is what is the key to all of this, is you have to embrace both sides of the equation. Is there negatives to fossil fuels? Yes. Is there negatives to solar and wind? Yes. Is there negatives to any form of energy? Yes. Does it outweigh the positives? Not even by a close shot when it comes to fossil fuels. It's been the most pro-human prosperity, life-giving substance that we've seen in the last several centuries. Nothing comes close in terms of our technological inventions.
I'd like to add two things there. I just did a piece that will be coming out shortly on Hurricane Beryl in response to Bloomberg. And the writer for Bloomberg points out that natural disaster costs, weather-related costs to Texas, he's speaking of Texas particularly, were $350 billion since 1980. Oh my God. That sounds pretty high. 1 year of oil and gas wholesaling in Texas, $496 billion, more than all of the costs since 1980. That puts it in perspective a bit. And to Mark's point, he was just talking about the decline in deaths due to weather and temperatures. What about the massive decline in hunger and starvation due to CO2 fertilization and the use of fossil fuels for agriculture that have occurred? The fewest number of starvation deaths in history, declining. That's not magic. It's not manna from heaven. It's fossil fuels, folks.
Yep. Indeed. Well, I think that'll do it for today. I really appreciate everyone being here. I want to thank Marc Morano, who is coming to us from Washington, D.C., although actually in front of a green screen, but that's okay. I know you're in the area.
I got my puppy here too, so you can say she was there.
Isn't that nice?
How can you hate me now? It's all good.
They'll find a way, Mark.
They
will find a way. You can learn and find more about Marc Morano at the absolutely essential website, climatedepot.com, where he has been debunking and having a lot of fun climate nonsense for many, many years. And also visit CFACT.org. Of course, myself and Sterling Burnett and Linnea Lueken are all we all work at the Heartland Institute, and you can learn more about us at the very simple to remember website, heartland.org. You can also go to climateataglance.com, a place where you can get our app for the Climate at a Glance book that we have that gives you all the information you need to battle climate alarmists wherever you may find them. Also visit energyataglance.com, and really the website that was kind of the spur for this entire show to begin with, climaterealism.com, where Sterling and Linnea and Anthony Watts and sometimes James Taylor debunk the crazy climate and inaccurate news of the week. I want to thank you all for watching this edition of the Climate Realism Show, and we will see you next Friday. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
He's a lion, dog-faced pony soldier.